Okay, so welcome back. Today is part two in our series where we're going to show you how to write your very first software application. And it's going to be this application here, which is charting data in real time. In part one, I encourage you to take a look at that. We show you how to download and install the free and extremely wonderful and very useful what's called an IDE, Integrated Development Environment. It makes writing your code so much easier. And it's a Microsoft product called Visual Studio. Again, it's free and extremely important and very useful to help you write your first code. So in this video, we're going to show you how to generate this application. And again, I encourage you to look at part one to show you how to get to this point where we can start writing this code. Now, we're going to generate this charting application. And one of the reasons is because if you have any interest in science, technology, engineering, anything technical, you probably are aware that data is extremely important. If you want to understand how the world works, it is really, really important. And also, as we mentioned before, hardware is stupid. I know a lot of people are very interested in hardware and excited by hardware, but at the end of the day, hardware does nothing. You really need to understand software. If you want to control things, if you want to monitor things, data acquisition. I've got a lot of videos talking about how you can use software to gather data. So the goal here is to help you to be confident that you can write your own software and do really cool stuff like this very quickly. So in part one, we got to this point where we loaded our very first project in Visual Studio. And we've got this blank form here. And if you start it up, you can see that it gives you a blank form with nothing on it, but we're going to turn that into a chart. So first thing we have to do, we showed before, you select the form and you can right click and you can see View Code F7. Very important, you're going to have to keep that in mind. If you want to look at the code that we can start generating for this, hit F7 or select this. And now we are in the basic code that we're going to start adding to make this form. So what I want to do is I'll go through some of the basic stuff you need to know to get around this form. Here you can see this window that's got code. Don't need to worry about all this stuff right now. On the right here, we've got what's called the Solution Explorer. What we have made is a blank solution. There's also a project, which is a subset of a solution, confusing, but don't worry about it right now. This is basically just a solution explorer that tells you all of the things that are inside this project and solution, okay? And you can see the tabs down here. Just so you know that, you're not going to have to use it right now. Down here, we've got a properties tab we're going to need a little bit later. Don't worry about that. And down on the bottom, we've got task list, error list, and output. Error list is nice when you're beginning because it tells you what the errors are. If you've written some code and there's an error, it tells you what that is. But really, what you really need to focus on is this main window here. Now, up top here, we've got these tabs that are the design, which shows you the actual form, and then the form1.cs or C#, which shows you the code that you're going to be writing, all right? And then up here is the start arrow, the start button. And you click on that to compile and to execute your code. So really, that's all you need to know right now. So we're going to start writing our code in here. And if you look up here on the top, you can see all these using statements. We're not going to need to worry about those right now. Just keep in mind that they are just a way to tell Visual Studio to use functionality from different libraries. And as you can see, some of these are grayed out, which means the code knows that you're not utilizing those, but you can if you need to. Now, the next thing we're going to do is figure out what do we need to do in order for this to become this scrolling application, all right? So let's do what is really important when you write any code, and that's just write down in regular language the things you're going to need in order to implement this. So now I've made this Visual Studio a little bit smaller, and I put this application we're going to develop on the side so we can kind of think about and write down what we're going to need. So what do we need in order to do this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write some comments. Extremely important when you're writing any software to write comments so you understand what's going on. So to do a comment, you do // and that defines everything on that line as a comment. So let's look at this and figure out what do we need to implement in order to do this. The first and most obvious thing is we need some sort of chart. So we're going to have to add chart. And once we have the chart, we're going to have to make sine wave. Okay, we got to give it something to chart. And then we're going to have to chart sine wave versus time. And we're going to have to do real-time updates somehow. Okay, so now if we go to our list, the first thing is we need to add a chart. How do you add a chart? Well, it's actually very simple. Go onto this Form 1 CS design and select the form, and you can see over here on the left is a toolbox. And if we go to the toolbox and we scroll down to data, under the data, if you open up the data, you can see one of the options is a chart. So you left click, drag and drop onto your form, and you now have added a chart. So it's all set to go. We just need to tell it what do we want to chart. So we're going to need some values of time and value of the sine wave that we can chart. So if you look at this, you select the chart and you go over here. We can now see down here is the properties tab, and it has all of the properties of this chart. If you scroll up, you can see the name is chart 1, and it's got a bunch of different properties that we can either set here or we can set in our code. The thing we're going to want to access is what's called a series, and I talk about this in my video on charts, where the series is basically the data you want to chart. So we're going to have to tell it what data we want to chart. We're going to have to make a sine wave, we're going to have to chart the sine wave versus time, and we're going to have to do some real-time updates. So first of all, we need to figure out what the data is. What is the sine wave value and what is the time value? Well, one way you can do it, and I've talked about this in my other videos on charts, is we can define what are called lists. And here is a couple lines of code that will allow us to define the x values and the corresponding y values that we want to chart. All right. Now you can see we've got these red squiggly lines, and that basically says, hey, you got a problem here. So if you hover over this, it says the type or namespace list could not be found. Are you missing a directive? And you can click on the show potential fixes, and it says we didn't add the system collections.generic, which is the library that allows you to make lists. So you double click on that and you scroll up. Oh, it added automatically system collections.generic, and now the squiggly's gone. So we can now make a list of x values and a list of y values to plot. And we have defined a list of double for each of those, which is it's a value with a decimal point. So we now can generate our x values and our y values and tell the chart to plot that. So now we've got the values, we need to figure out what we're going to plot. We have to figure out how we're going to generate sine waves. Well, luckily there is another library called the math library, and we can use that to generate sine waves. So what sine wave do we want to generate? Well, first of all, we need to know, what does a sine wave look like? So right here, I'm going to paste a comment that says what the sine wave looks like. It has an amplitude and has a sine function. And inside the sine function, you've got 2 times pi times whatever frequency times the time value. So we're going to have time values, which are these x values. We're going to figure out what the sine function gives us, and that's going to be the y values. So now we should be able to go down here and write some code using this system.math and generate a sine wave. So let's say double sine val equals, we'll give it an amplitude of 10 times math.sine, and we'll say 2 times math.pi, you can see it recognizes that, times frequency. So we're going to have to come up with a frequency. Let's say 0.05 hertz times some time val. Okay, so we're going to have to come up with the time value that we're going to put into these x values. So we're going to be plotting time value versus y values. This brings up the question of how we're going to figure out the timing and the real-time updates. Well, if we look at this, we can see that this thing is updating a few times a second. So we're going to have to do something in the software to tell the software to update the values a few times a second. So how do you do that? Well, there is a very nice and very, very useful and very commonly used feature called an event. And an event is basically something that taps your software on the shoulder every half a second or tenth of a second or whatever, and says, hey, the timer is timed out, we need to do this code. So what we're going to do is maybe 5 times a second, we're going to tap the software on the shoulder and say, hey, run this code to update this chart 5 times a second, all right? And that's called an event, and the code that it executes to update the chart is called an event handler. So how are we going to do that? Well, we go back to our Form 1 design, and we've got our chart. We're going to have to add what's called a timer, a system timer. And we go into the toolbox and scroll down. You can see down here in the main list of tools is a timer. Left click, drag over the form, and it will, you can see right here, it is automatically added timer 1, which is a system timer. And over in the properties, you can see timer 1. It's got a name, timer 1. Enabled is false, which means it's not working yet. We have to make it work. And interval 100, and that's, if you click on interval, you can see the note, the frequency of elapsed events in milliseconds. So this says every 100 milliseconds, it's going to tap our software on the shoulder and say, hey, do whatever you want to do to update your chart or whatever. So what we can do is we can change that to 200 milliseconds, which will update it 5 times a second. And now we have our timer, and all we need to do is generate some code in the software that will respond whenever this timer times out every 200 milliseconds. So how do we do that? Well, you just go back to the timer icon, double click on it, and you can see it is automatically added what's called an event handler. These are extremely useful in engineering applications. You use them all the time. So every 200 milliseconds, it's going to come to this block of code, and we can basically, at this point, update the chart every 200 milliseconds, all right? So every 200 milliseconds, we're going to have to generate another sine value and another time value, and then tell the chart to plot it. So what I can do is I can take my sine value, Control X, Control V, and we have now defined the sine value that we're going to add to the chart. We also need to generate an X value, or the time value. So we need to generate X val and generate Y val. And the sine value is going to be the Y val, and we need to generate some sort of time value. So what we can do is every time this timer ticks, we can give it a time val equals time val plus 1. And all that's going to do is increment this value of time val every time we get a tick. And then we can add that as a new xval, xvals.add time val. So this is adding the next time val to this list of values. Problem is we haven't defined time val yet. So let's go back up here and say public double time val equals 0. Okay, so now we have a time val starts at 0, it's going to increment, and we have added that to the x vals, and we now need to generate the sine value and add that to the y vals. So y vals dot add sine val, and now we've added the time and the sine value to the lists, and all we have to do now is just plot them. So how are we going to plot them? Well, we just need one line of code to plot these. And I talked about this in my series on C# charts, where we use what's called a data bind XY, and we're feeding it the X vals and the Y vals list, and it automatically takes whatever the values are in those lists and charts them the way they are. So I've got chart 1, series 1, points, data bind XY, X vals and Y vals. Again, I encourage you to look at my series on charts to explain more of what this is, but pretty simple. You just execute this and it will generate the chart. So now it looks like we're all set. We've got our X values, Y values. Every 0.2 of a second is going to update that. So now let's run it and see what we get. So we run it and we get nothing. There's nothing on the chart. Well, as I showed you before, if you click on the timer, you can see timer enabled equals false. So what we have to do is we also have to enable the timer. What we can do is come up here after the initialized component, timer 1.enabled equals true. And that should enable the timer. So let's run it now. And you can see it is now updating the chart with a sine wave. Unfortunately, it is a bar chart instead of a line chart. So we do have to add a couple lines of code to make it a line chart. But you can see we're pretty much there. So now to change that from a bar chart to a line chart, we're going to come up here and add using system to Windows Forms Data Visualization.charting, and that will allow us to change that. And we're going to do this one line of code, chart1.series, series 1, chart type equals series chart type.line. And when we run that, you can see it has now changed it into a line chart, and it's charting our sine wave. So you can see it's really pretty straightforward. There's only a few lines of code. You just need to know that you need a timer and how to set this up, but really pretty straightforward. And that should give you some encouragement to be able to write some simple C# or other applications to gather data. As I show in some of the other videos on C# charts, you can modify this. There's a lot of other things you can do with charts. But I encourage you to take a look at those and get familiar with charting. It's very important in the scientific engineering community. Now what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to show you how to, instead of generating data here, generating sine wave, we're going to show you how to grab data acquired from external sources, bring it in over the COM or USB port, and chart it in real time so you can measure stuff. You don't have to rely on stuff like the very limited Arduino serial monitor and that kind of thing. You can make some really fancy things. We also did some series of videos on converting an Arduino to an oscilloscope or a logger application, so I encourage you to look at that. Otherwise, that's about it for this one. If you like this video or any of the videos on this channel, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, let others know that we're here so we can get some more viewers. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care and have a really good day. Thanks.